I'm going to turn this over to Andy Batten at EPA.
Welcome everyone to our eEnterprise Fiscal Year 16 Partnerships Action Plan webinar. My name is Andy Batten and I'm the Director of eEnterprise for the Environment for EPA, located in the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. Today we're going to be joined by senior leaders from States and EPA. First, it will be Tom Burak, the Commissioner of the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, and also the co-chair of the eEnterprise Leadership Council. He's co-chair along with EPA's Deputy Administrator, Stan Meiberg. Also joining us today is Mark Haig. Mark's EPA's Regional Administrator for Region 7, and is also a member of the eEnterprise Leadership Council. And we want to welcome the many state, tribal, and EPA participants, as well as non-governmental folks listening in who are contractors to these efforts. Contractor support for the webinar today is provided by Kristen Durox from Ross Strategic, who you heard from a moment ago. And I'm going to turn it back over to Kristen to go over the logistics and ground rules. Kristen.
Hi, everyone. We're going to take a few minutes to walk through the logistics today. As you've all probably realized, you come and are muted. That's given the large number of participants we have today. If you would like to ask a question, you will be able to type those questions throughout the webinar into this question and answer box in your dashboard. If this dashboard has disappeared from your computer, it's likely just collapsed to the side of the screen. You should see this little red arrow here, and you can click that to open it back up to type your question in. We'll be taking questions throughout the webinar. Feel free to type them in at any time, but we won't be answering questions till the end of the webinar to make sure that we get through all of the sections that we need to get through. If you have any technical questions, please feel free to use the same chat function or to send me an email, and my email address came through when you registered today. All right, I will turn it back over. Oh, and we are recording today's webinar. Apologies. So just want to let everyone know that. So I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Andy Batten to go over the objectives for today's call.
Thanks, Kristen. Today's webinar is to inform the regions and states, as well as tribes and others that are on the call, about current eEnterprise efforts, and specifically about the opportunities to identify process streamlining projects to become nationally scalable, and for regions and states to look together at temporary trade-offs in states' workload in exchange for the states putting some dedicated work on an eEnterprise project. We're working towards a March 31st deadline for states and regions to identify candidate national projects, and we want everyone to be aware of the FY 2016 Partnerships Action Plan. We call it the PAP, the PAP for short, Partnerships Action Plan, and we're looking for the regions and states to work together to identify the enterprise projects as is called for in this Partnerships Action Plan. First, Tom and I are going to give you a brief overview of the enterprise for the environment. Then we're going to go through the FY 16 Partnerships Action Plan and the national program guidances. We'll then turn it over to Mark, and Mark will present the regional examples of potential eEnterprise projects that are occurring in Region 7. And we'll then discuss opportunities for states and regions to identify projects that are consistent with eEnterprise goals that could be brought forward to the eEnterprise Leadership Council under the Partnerships Action Plan. We're then going to conclude the presentation part of the webinar with some next steps, and then we'll finally get to the questions that we hope you'll be sending in. So remember to be able to, you have that ability to type in questions throughout the webinar. So I'm going to turn it over now to Tom Burak, and Tom's going to give some background about eEnterprise.
Thank you very much, Andy. eEnterprise, as you can see here, eEnterprise for the Environment is a new model for collaborative leadership among environmental co-regulators aimed at simplifying and modernizing the implementation of environmental programs. It's really about three things. The first is streamlining business processes. The second is introducing technology where it's appropriate to help maximize efficiency. And the third is ensuring shared ownership and adoption of the streamlined process through joint governance. I love this slide because I think it illustrates that sometimes we are just so busy in our day-to-day jobs of protecting the environment that it's difficult to take the time and the opportunity to step back and to see how we might actually streamline and modernize how we do our jobs. Certainly here in New Hampshire, we have found time and time again that sometimes we have to slow down a little bit in order to speed things up in the longer term. So some time spent in the short term in order to be more efficient and more productive in the longer term. You go to the next slide, please, Kristen. Thank you. E-Enterprise has established three main goals that, at a high level, articulate the fundamental change that we're really working to accomplish here. The first goal is aimed at improving the effectiveness of current programs by streamlining business processes. It's important to mention here that the streamlining and modernizing of our programs is listed as the first goal because it needs to come first before we apply modern technology. What we want to do is to first re-engineer and rethink and redesign our processes, and then automate or use other technology where appropriate to accomplish even further streamlining and potentially even greater efficiencies. A second goal is to greatly enhance our services to stakeholders, the public and agency partners. E-Enterprise seeks to reduce transaction costs and burdens for the regulated community and governmental agencies, and to improve the transparency of environmental conditions and performance for all users, including the public. An example of enhancing user experience is the E-Enterprise portal, which will enable regulated entities, co-regulators, and the public to conduct two-way transactions and customize their access to environmental web resources. Another example under development is the work being led by Texas, Arizona, and the EPA Air Program folks to consolidate and streamline air emissions reporting. At the heart of E-Enterprise is the third goal, a commitment by the co-regulators in the National Enterprise for Environmental Protection to operate this partnership as a transformative model for joint governance. We are committed to the principle of early engagement and collaboration among EPA, state, and tribal partners, working together to streamline, modernize, and integrate our shared business processes and management approaches. E-Enterprise joint governance is led by the E-Enterprise Leadership Council, which is a council of 10 senior EPA executives and 10 state commissioners. We've had tribal participation, and we're seeking further heightened tribal participation. As I think you can see from this slide, which identifies the current members of the EELC, collectively we have pulled together an impressive group of senior environmental officials from across the country and within the Beltway who are committed to modernizing how we do our business and transforming how we work together. I'm now going to hand things back to Andy to introduce the Partnership Action Plan and the link to the National Program Guidance documents.
Great, thank you, Tom. What we really wanted to focus on in the use of the NPM guidances and in turn the Partnerships Action Plan was the institutionalization of E-Enterprise as the new way of doing business. One way of doing this is to embed E-Enterprise in EPA's formal operational structure, which is what we did when we added language about E-Enterprise to our national program guidance. These guidances every year provide a framework for regions, states, and tribes to develop strategies. In this case, we've moved to a 2-year strategy for implementing environmental programs. Another way is to embed E-Enterprise in EPA's strategic plan, which is what we did under the Partnerships Cross-Agency Strategy, which in turn led us to the FY16 Partnerships Action Plan. And although these are both EPA documents, they're also about how EPA will work with its co-regulator partners. So it was both appropriate and consistent with the joint governance goal that states and EPA and tribes where they're engaged jointly craft the ideas and language. Under the FY16 Partnerships Action Plan, states, regions in particular, are asked that by March 31st, they identify some business process streamlining projects that can become nationally scalable, and by September 30th, for regions and states to look together at temporary trade-offs in the state's workload in exchange for the state doing dedicated work on an e-enterprise project or similar project. With the March 31st deadline rapidly approaching, we wanted everyone to be aware of this Partnerships Action Plan and the need to work together to identify projects. This is one of the means we're doing this through this webinar, and there'll be other webinars that follow as well. Let's go to the next slide. What's on the screen in front of you are examples of projects that are already embedded in the NPM guidances that align with the enterprise. And under the Partnerships Action Plan, these could also offer a starting place to discuss potential enhancements to these projects, as well as discussing other projects originating within the regions and states that are not listed on this slide. On the next slide, we want to talk about lean in the enterprise. Lean is a leading method that states and EPA have used to streamline business processes. And as Tom mentioned, under Goal 1, EPA and states have used lean to advance the enterprise projects. As you can see from this graphic, both lean and the enterprise have a very significant overlap and are complementary. They're not the same thing by any means. Lean is often used to streamline processes that are not co-regulatory business processes, and there are many e-enterprise activities that don't involve the use of lean. But where there is that overlap, lean can be a very important tool to advance the work of the enterprise. Lean can help set the agenda for streamlining and provides a manageable frame to define core efficiencies and a highly effective tool to design their delivery. Where co-regulatory partners participate in lean efforts, we also achieve the key third e-enterprise goal of joint governance. Both states and EPA have used and are using lean individually and together, and some of these joint lean efforts may provide ideas for projects to scale up under the FY16 Partnerships Action Plan. What I'd like to do next is turn to Mark Haig, the administrator from Region 7, who will tell us what his region has done to advance the enterprise goals. Mark?
Great. Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Tom, and thank you, everyone who's listening in today and participating on the webinar. What I'd like to talk a little bit about in a few minutes is just some efforts we already have underway that get at one of the priorities of joint governance and kind of support the principles of the e-enterprise effort. What I'd like to do, though, is if I can indulge the group to take just a minute and kind of have a little bit of an anecdote that I think will help you understand a little bit more about the first bullet that you're seeing on your slide. And in Region 7, we have taken on the concepts of leaning, or what we like to, we've branded as process excellence, which is really to bring the whole suite of improvement, business process improvement tools to the table to help streamline and make more efficient our processes and those that we work with on the state. But the anecdote and a little bit of historical reflection here that I'd like to bring in is that, you know, it wasn't just EPA Region 7 that sort of pushed this out. A number of years ago, probably 10 or 12, several of our states, particularly Iowa, were very active in the Kaizen or lean efforts, and really came to us a couple of times wanting to consider how we could work together on some of these projects. And so we took that on, and this was even before the concept of joint governance was anywhere in our vernacular. But again, it was just an effort of the recognition by the states that when they were doing some of these projects, they saw intersection with EPA's work, and eventually us coming to the conclusion jointly that we all needed to be working on those. So, you know, we've had a little bit of history which has helped us make some progress now, particularly now that we're in the e-enterprise environment. And one of the things we did here in the region about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, was stand up our process excellence team and really create a network of facilitators from within our own workforce who could support our internal efforts on process excellence. We got speaking with the states on things we were doing, wanting to hear what they were doing, and then frankly quite organically practitioners out at the state level and our own internal network of process excellence champions sort of got together and realized they had a lot of mutual interest about the work they were trying to do and facilitate within their organization. So about a year ago, they all got together here in the regional office to talk about what could they do as a collaborative and sort of a strong network of people committed to process excellence to provide support to each other and collaborate on what kind of activities they were doing, maybe even have opportunities where if we were working on a project that we would get some sort of outside third-party facilitators from the state and us possibly helping them, but to really look at projects we had underway, discuss how we could improve those, how we could bring in the concepts of joint governance and e-enterprise to those. What was going on in one state with EPA may be something another state might not take on, waiting to see the benefits and the outcome of that effort, and then tailoring it or finding ways to replicate that in the other states. So again, this group has continued to meet. We were just up in Iowa, meeting up there with them again, representatives from all 4 states and EPA. Again, just building that network, collaborating on projects, finding ways to replicate our work, and most certainly find ways to be efficient in what we were doing together so that we didn't all start working on the same projects or get the scope too big before we can show some success. And I think from those we're learning things that are transporting across our states, and think there's some potential there to not only replicate this kind of network nationally, but some of the work we're getting accomplished. Let me just highlight a couple of those that we already have underway. Kind of an outgrowth of the Leadership Council, which I'm on, as well as Sarah Parker-Pauley from the Missouri Department of Natural Resources. We're right in the middle now of beginning to scope and examine a process where we can look at how we can deal with impaired waters and finding ways to get those waters restored for their uses. When Sarah and I talked about this project and doing it, one of the guiding principles we used is let's agree on the outcome that we want to achieve. And in this case, really getting water quality improved in the state of Missouri. So we agree on the outcome, particularly she and I as leaders of our organization. And then let's help facilitate folks from her organization and ours to get to that endpoint. We're a little less worried about the journey as we are about the destination here. So right now we're, again, going back to the network. One of our trained facilitators is going to be the person from EPA who's outside of the water work and the water world will come in and help work with us to facilitate that effort moving forward. We've got a meeting here in a week or two. And in kind of a joint governance matter, we're meeting halfway between the state capitol and our regional office, and we're going to start buckling down and rolling up our sleeves and do the scoping so that we can start moving on the project into the very detailed mapping and other work we need to do to show some improvements. The key point on this and some other work we've done too is when I refer to EPA, it's really EPA Region 7, and we've also had good support getting our headquarters stakeholders in that conversation as well. This is something they want to see done nationally. We're following some guidance and direction from EPA national office, and so this is an attempt for us in the state of Missouri to find a way to put that guidance and encouragement from headquarters into action. So based on that, one of the things we've talked about and Tom mentioned was scalability and replication and national implication. What we've talked about on this project is let's work it through with EPA in Missouri with support from headquarters, and then keep our states informed along the way of what we're doing so we can find ways to transfer the benefits we get out of that to the other states here in our region and hopefully elsewhere across the country. Iowa's been taking the lead and working on improving their e-permitting system, working on that and getting the documentation together, and we think that again will be help us deal with some of the technological aspects of how we do our work and improve the reporting and permitting work that we get done under the air quality program. For several years now, one of our early big projects here in the region, and this was frankly a multi-region headquarters effort, us in Region 3, along with folks in the Office of OLEM, our Office of Land and Emergency Management, working on the RCRA Corrective Action Program. You know, we all have these 2020 goals to clean up a number of RCRA Corrective Action sites, and the timeline to getting some of those projects done was just enormously long. And so us in Region 3 and headquarters, various states across the country, and even in some case, some of the stakeholders put a lot of time and effort into finding ways to develop what we now call the corrective action framework to get a better improvement. You can see the numbers on the slide and the time we need to do to get work plans approved. I think we can all appreciate that the planning of the work sometimes takes as long or longer than the work itself. So, you know, big gains there that we think we can see nationally, and it'll speed up and really trim back the time it takes to get a site cleaned up. And one of the things that's ongoing now is training across the country in various states. I know we've been to Ohio and Region 3, and I think out in California, giving people this framework of, you know, not every tool is 100% replicable in another region or another state. And so this a little bit recognizes there's not necessarily always a one-size-fits-all, but we can put a suite of tools together that allow people to get some of the efficiency gains that we've identified in these new tools and then implement those within their state. So again, it's really important once we come to these projects and come to the improved efficiencies, again, in a joint governance and shared learning and an enterprise sense, find ways to replicate that across the country. And that's what's really going on well now. And it's been a great collaborative effort of several regions and a number of states and associations as we've moved forward. Just this week, we had folks from our headquarters office out doing some business, and they're here even today, doing some business process tool training in the region. And as I've gone from meeting to meeting, and this goes back to Tom's favorite slide, you know, I ask folks here, you know, they're always like, boy, this is really good, but do we have the time? And my reply to that is we can't afford not to invest the time in this. We're all under constrained resources, and particularly like in the project in Missouri where we're trying to improve our outcomes. And if that means some trade-offs in the near term to get to a better process earlier, I've sent the message to managers and staff, you let me know where and what I can do to create that space for you to get this work done. And if that means there's a few more activities that we might do, it's not that we disagree that we need to improve water quality or improve air quality, it's just we need to create the space, as I like to say to folks, to get this work done to improve our processes. I think every one of us probably on this call can think of a place where if you just had the time, you could find a better way to get this work done. So I think it's really important to give folks the support to create that space, to make trade-offs, because it's not a trade-off of the environment and environmental protection. It's a trade-off to find a way to improve how we get that work done. And in the case of RCRA corrective action and other places, done quicker and better. And so if in the short term there's a little bit of time invested to get to those long-term gains, it's really important to be able to give people the support they need, and we've tried to do that here in the region and had great cooperation from our states to get that done. And if that means, you know, modifying agreements or re-describing them in ways to create the outcomes around these kind of projects, we're ready and willing to do that. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Tom.
Mark, thank you very, very much. And I just want to just pick up with a quick example out of Region 1 that I think is very consistent with what you just described, Mark. This is something that we here in New Hampshire recognized as one of our needs to look at the time that we spend putting together our performance partnership agreements and negotiating our performance partnership grants as well with EPA. We've been operating under those since 1997, nearly 20 years, and I think there was a recognition that we needed to take a step back and get a shared understanding of what what those processes really entail, because they are tremendously time-consuming. And we agreed to do a joint lean exercise, and we learned a great deal from each other. And again, this was aimed initially solely at just how do New Hampshire and EPA Region 1 work together to better on these things. What we quickly found is that the learnings were applicable to most, if not all, of the other New England states, and we identified one technology gain that we could make by bringing in a SharePoint site to have a common platform on which we could do all of our negotiations of the documents. And we're now not only seeing that getting used regionally, but in fact other regions across the country are starting to pick up a lot of these themes and ideas that came out of this particular lean exercise. The point here just is that sometimes things, and I want to encourage 1,000 flowers to bloom here. Ideas will start small. You think they may only be applicable to us, but we spend the time on them, and what we discover is that we can gain a lot of advantages for ourselves in terms of time saved, greater efficiencies, and others can then learn and benefit from that. Where does that leave us now as we go forward? Over the next 6 to 8 weeks, we really want states and regions across the country to have conversations about the NPM guidance documents and the Partnerships Action Plan, with the goal of identifying proposed business process modernization projects that are consistent with the goals and principles of the enterprise, and with the expectation that some of those projects would be put forward to the E-Enterprise Leadership Council. Again, to be clear, many of these projects will be small. They may just involve your state and the region. They could be several of the states in the region, but they could be projects that you look at and say multiple states and the region are interested in this, and we think that this might actually be something of interest to folks in other regions as well. It could be nationally scalable. And what I really want folks to understand is that a critical step in this process is to also jointly identify where temporary trade-offs in traditional work plan activities would be proposed in order to make room for this business process modernization work. And again, this trade-offs notion, and Mark just discussed it, is equally applicable to just a small-scale sort of just state and region working together project, such as, for example, the Missouri project that Mark described earlier, or it could have been that TPA-PPG project that I described, right on up to the nationally scalable projects. And I think this is what makes the Partnerships Action Plan business as unusual as opposed to business as usual. Because the trade-offs idea doesn't require asking for additional resources. But instead what it really says is that this work is important enough to temporarily set aside certain other work tasks so that the modernization work can be accomplished within existing resources. Now again, for example, that we have talked about here in Region 1, similar to the example that Mark Hay described earlier in Region 7, would be streamlining the 303D, 305B listing process for designating and restoring impaired waters. The temporary trade-off could be for the state to say, look, EPA, we'd like to write fewer TMDLs next year and use that freed up time to work with you and maybe some of the other states in our region to streamline the TMDL drafting process so that in subsequent years it may be possible for us to be even more productive. But again, there does not have to necessarily be a nexus between the work that will be reduced temporarily and the program or outputs that will be streamlined. In the example I just gave, yes, there was a direct nexus, but it's not essential for these to be considered as valid proposals. Each situation is going to be evaluated on its own merits. And what I'd like to do now is turn things back to Andy Batten to wrap up the presentation on the Partnerships Action Plan, and then we will move to questions.
Great. Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Mark. As we mentioned, the Partnerships Action Plan outlines a process in which we're asking the region states together to look at co-regulatory business processes they're already streamlining or planning to. and identify at least one per region that might be a good candidate to scale up as a national e-enterprise project. The action plan says projects already planned or underway, because with the short deadline of March 31st, we thought it would be simpler for regions and states to propose improvements that they've already thought about and wanted to make, but haven't had a good chance to bring forward. And that familiarity would help to promote strong state and regional ownership. But we certainly also want to encourage regions and states to come up with new ideas, that they can put together coherent projects with that strong mutual ownership by March 31st. Above all, we want this to empower the states and regions to participate in setting the e-enterprise agenda, especially for those who are not on the e-enterprise leadership council. This is about broadening that participation outside of just the council members. So projects that regions and states jointly identify will then go to the regular program discussions of the regional division directors and the national program managers. These are groups within EPA. And those discussions will consider those projects or activities in consultations with the states as to whether they should be recommended to the e-enterprise leadership council for potential selection as a national e-enterprise project or enhancement. It's important to add here that projects identified as important to one or more states and the region, but that don't ultimately go forward as nationally scalable, may still be worthy of moving forward as a real state project. We do very much want this effort to promote e-enterprise-oriented activities, so regions and states are encouraged to continue to work together on any project or any activity that they propose to the national programs. But don't get all the way through the process for selecting e-enterprise projects. So whether or not it's a small project or one that goes national forward for consideration, we want to encourage that dialogue. So for more information on the enterprise, you can visit the following websites that are listed on the screen here. In addition, feel free to contact the following people that are listed regarding e-enterprise, the NPM guidance, or the FY16 Partnership Action Plan. I'm now going to turn it back over to Kristen to moderate our question and answer session. Kristen?
Thanks, Andy. I just want to remind folks that if they have questions, they're welcome to type them into the question and answer box. Also, I know this conversation is a little more nuanced, so if you're not comfortable typing in your question, if you just want to type in question, I can also attempt to unmute you and you can ask it verbally over the phone. At this point, Andy, we've had a few folks ask about contacts, both within the regions, like who they contact within their region, or broadly beyond just the folks that are on this slide, if anyone wants to speak to that.
I can start with that. Folks, for a little bit of history on e-enterprise, one of the resource groups that I would recommend are those that are already engaged on the Exchange Network. So the Exchange Network has been a successful state travel EPA project for well over a decade. And the regional grant coordinators for the Exchange Network are also heavily involved in the e-enterprise activities. In fact, the Exchange Network has been embodied in and is the technical foundation for e-enterprise. So there is on the slide in front of you where we have a link to e-enterprise. There are also links to the Exchange Network, people that can be reached out to, and they will be able to provide some guidance on this as well. Beyond that, I would ask that within your, if you're coming from a particular program, I would ask that you try to provide questions back up through the program leadership. So if you're working in the water program, there should be the ability to reach back and access somebody within the water program, reaching back up through the lead region, and then back to headquarters if there's an interest in getting a contact on a particular project. Again, I'm just thinking of a way to track it back through the media program that the question may be originating from. So within the structure of governance, there is representation by all media programs within EPA. So there should be a way somebody in a media program should be able to find additional and maybe more local instruction or background on e-enterprise. But again, I would certainly feel free. Anybody can shoot me an email. My email is listed there. Beth Graves is also listed there, and we will help find the appropriate contact in your region if needed.
Andy, as a quick follow-up to that, Amy Miller asked if there was a form to fill out for project submission, that kind of, or if there was any type of formal process, and then do the regions submit or do the states submit?
That's a great question, and one that we had anticipated, and we wanted to ensure that we're looking at this as not an opportunity to just submit a project for consideration. We really want to use the normal dialogues, the regular occurring dialogues between the regions and the states to ensure that there is joint buy-in, joint participation, joint prioritization on a particular project. So I would ask the audience to think about using those regular forums, those regular discussions as the opportunity to tee up projects for consideration. In the past, back in 2014, we did have a process that we cast wide and far a net for various project ideas. And out of that, we selected 5 projects. And I think if we began today and tried that similar process, we'd probably come up with a different set of 5. What we're really trying to do by embedding this in the national program guidance and embedding it in the Partnerships Action Plan is to encourage joint dialogue with particularly the regional offices and states so that there is a joint commitment to a project and not just a piece of paper with a project idea on it. There's not saying that those ideas won't have merit, but we want to ensure that there's a robust dialogue and buy-in jointly to a particular project idea. So really thinking about the regular meetings that a state may have with their regional office and also a regional office that in their regular business with the states, using those forums to ensure that these discussions occur.
Hey, Kristen, it's Tom. May I jump in here with a couple thoughts?
Please do.
One is that certainly given the relatively tight timelines here, in terms of proposals for projects that are nationally scalable, I think the expectation is that those are things that would be jointly discussed and agreed, often through existing forums, as Andy has suggested, between the states and EPA, and presumably the regions with the states are going to bring those projects forward, and I imagine get further detailed guidance out to the regions as to where those need to be submitted and the like. I will just say that from the standpoint, for example, of New Hampshire, where we're actually sort of out of cycle now with respect to negotiation of our PPG priorities and commitments, but where we, in fact, in our priorities and commitments list last year, actually agreed jointly with Region 1 that we were going to identify 1 or more projects that we could work on jointly, particularly a lean type project. What we're doing actually is going to be very shortly putting out a joint memo from the regional administrator here and myself to all of his staff and our staff here in New Hampshire, really laying out a quick process by which we're going to be collecting joint ideas here, some of which may be nationally scalable, some of which may not be, but that we're going to use. And as soon as we have our memo out, we'll be happy to share that with others. And if it's useful to others to crib off of it in some fashion, they'll certainly be most welcome to do so. So I think it's going to be a combination of trying to use all the existing forms that you have, but also, again, at least in terms of developing the nationally scalable proposals, probably trying to have some kind of a quick internal process within your region to be able to get those discussions going if they're not already happening.
Mark, could I draw you into the discussion, particularly about opportunities where there are regional division director meetings with the MPMs and where states may be able to participate in those discussions?
Sure. Thank you, Andy. Again, I think a lot of that is already going on in terms of the division director meetings. I haven't really got every feedback session I get to. Someone somewhere is working on some sort of lean or process improvement, process excellence effort at some level, and particularly with the states. And to Tom's earlier point, a little bit of the 1,000 flowers, it's important for us to identify some projects of scalability coming here into March. But one thing we found, and it may work, is to get into them a little bit and do that scoping and a little bit of the process improvement effort up front to make sure you know what that project is that you might want to be scaling up a little bit earlier on, so that you can kind of work the things in tandem. Whether it ends up in our PAP come the end of March or not, I'm not sure, but it's okay. And I think one thing we've learned is sometimes us in the state getting together and spending a little time to flush that out to better understand where our outcomes are and what we want to achieve is really beneficial before you might be able to answer the scalability question.
Thanks. And I would just put a fine point on that. We really do want to encourage those dialogues so that there is joint ownership to a project as it comes forward, either for national scalability or obviously for local involvement. And making sure that there's joint involvement really requires that dialogue to occur. So I think about this more than just a project proposal on a piece of paper, but how the dialogue would occur around a particular idea, and what is the forum for that dialogue. And there are a lot of meetings between states and regions where I think we would have natural outlets for these discussions.
And Andy, if I could inject just another sort of anecdote, Tom mentioned the work on Region 1 in New Hampshire and the other states on streamlining and looking at their PPA, PPG process. And much like Region 1, we've had agreements in place for decades now and a pretty good network of people working on those. But to get to the point of scalability and things we can stand up, it doesn't have to be the whole thing. The SharePoint site and things like that, when we heard of what people were doing and the question was asked of us, what are you doing to replicate that? There's some feedback of, well, we've got a good process already, but the willingness to look into what's being done and find those things that further enhance your process. So, part of that was just being able to say, the SharePoint site might be a good tool for us to employ for our own established process that's pretty well streamlined, I hope. I know we've done some things over the years to make it so. But the willingness to look at your process, see what others have done, and find those things that you can scale up or replicate to make your process a little better. And I think the SharePoint one was one we immediately went to, and by the time I got asked the question, what are we doing, folks around the table who support us on this effort were like, we're already talking to Regions 1 and 5 about SharePoint and what we can do to replicate that. So again, it's that willingness and openness to accept some of these things, even if you do have what you might think is a pretty good process.
Andy, Vincent Pirelli from New Hampshire had a related question, and I just wanted to offer, I can unmute you, Vincent, if you have a follow-up. You're unmuted now if you wanted to follow up at all.
Thanks, Kristen. My question was, the memo that Tom referenced is just fresh off the presses now. We haven't finalized it yet. But right now, there's a March 31st deadline to sort of generate initial ideas. And then there's a subsequent deadline, related deadline, to discuss trade-offs in September. So you're talking a good 5-6 months after the fact. And I'm wondering if having that deadline a little tighter and certainly earlier in the conversation, the extent that trade-offs are available may help in the selection of projects. So there seems to be a long space, wide space between projects on the table and then the trade-offs. It seems like that would have to happen earlier. That's all.
Yeah, it's a good observation. I think when we were looking at the notion of trade-offs, we were thinking of that in a more localized extent. So Mark, for instance, in talking with his states and documenting those trade-offs, it would be localized or regional to multi-state level. It will take a while for us to digest ideas that are going to have, I think, a broader or potential national scalability. So we were somewhat thinking of these as independent from each other. But again, trade-offs are for a much broader range of projects, and they explicitly don't have to include a national aspect to them. It can be localized, and I think that's the difference I would try to point out there.
Thanks, Andy. I appreciate it. And you know, in the package that Tom said we're willing to share, and we certainly are. We put together sort of an idea collection table, and one of the required fields is barriers, resource constraints, possible trade-offs. So to the extent that as we collect ideas, we can get a sense of trade-offs that may or may not have a direct nexus. We're going to try to do that earlier than later, certainly when we do this here in Region 1 to start. So thank you for that answer. I appreciate it.
Yes.
This is Tom. Could I just jump in with one further thought on that? Again, the further notion on trade-offs is that certainly it be applicable to the nationally scalable projects, and it'll probably be important for the states and the regions that are submitting those ideas to the national level, that they've at least given some initial thought to what those work trade-offs might be in order to be able to accomplish that project. But at the same time, for smaller projects that are being thought about and developed at the state level with their regions, regional offices, we wanted to give them enough time to really think that through, sort of to give them through the end of the current fiscal year, on the assumption that a lot of the work plans for the next fiscal year are probably being negotiated over the next 6 months or so, and to give them that time to figure out what those trade-offs might look like as they look into the following fiscal year for work plan deliverables, and what the trade-offs might be in order to be able to spend some more time doing this e-enterprise process improvement work.
Tom and Andy, this is Mark again. Just maybe a finer point on something Andy said earlier. For example, the Missouri project, although we've quite gotten yet to the area of identifying specific trade-offs, but I think Andy answered a question about, is it region-wide kind of trade-offs? Well, one way to approach it is we might make some trade-offs in Missouri or any other state to work to create the space, as I like to call it, to work on this project. Meanwhile, the other 3 states keep doing their work, but then we bring and replicate or transfer that project and scale it up region-wide and maybe nationally. Helps avoiding maybe everybody making trade-offs along the way. So again, that's part of where I think our network can kind of help work through and improve the coordination and communication about what we're each doing, so we're not all making trade-offs in similar areas for similar outcomes if it's being worked in one state or maybe with a couple of others moving forward. And it saves us down the road too. We all kind of take it on as one, with the notion of, in the back of our mind, of always thinking, and how can we apply this elsewhere?
Great. Clancy Roberts from Tennessee has a question. Clancy, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you if you want to go ahead and ask the question.
This is programmatic stuff. This is.
Hey, Clancy, there was a lot of background noise when I muted you, so I'm going to try that again.
Yes. Uh-oh. Do they want us
Clancy?
to say? Did we get unmuted?
You're unmuted, Clancy?
Muted.
You are unmuted, yes. All right. Clancy, if you still have a question, if you want to go ahead and type it in. It sounds like we're having some audio issues. I'm going to jump to Robert's hand, and apologies for that. Robert asked, do the candidate projects have to have a strong connection to co-regulatory processes, or would projects with less of a clear-cut nexus, e.g. PPA, PPG process improvement work? Sorry.
Kristen, can you repeat that?
Absolutely. Sorry about that. So Robert asked, do the candidate projects have to have a strong connection to co-regulatory processes, or would projects with less of a clear-cut nexus work?
I wouldn't rule out any idea. Again, I really think this boils down to the dialogue that we really want to encourage jointly. I really think it's about identifying joint priorities and making sure that those discussions occur. And I wouldn't say one is going to be favored over any other. I don't want to discourage any idea.
This is Tom. I would certainly agree with that, and I would just say that the notion of joint priorities is certainly critical. But I would also argue that sometimes what one party perceives as a priority may not be seen by the other as a priority, unless and until they actually have a conversation and really understand the problems that they're each facing, or the challenges they're facing in trying to implement something the way things currently exist or the way they currently operate. And sometimes the way these things start is by saying, could we just have a conversation? Could we just do a quick Kaizen, or could I just explain to you how this process works for us and what impact it has on our resource constraints, or how our resources are, respond to this. And then I'd really like to understand what your challenges and issues are in applying this. And once you share notes like that, you discover, actually, we do have a common problem that if we spend some time working on it together, we can make some progress with it. And frankly, that's where our PPA, PPG process started. And ultimately, what we discovered is it actually had some national scalability or implications. But things often start small. And as Andy said, I would encourage you to look at things of all scale. Don't think that we're trying to find, the 5 or 10 best projects that are going to be identified as the major projects to go forward here. We really want projects to go forward at all scales. Just certain ones will be able to get some limited additional support here. And maybe, Andy, to be appropriate for you just to take a moment and talk about, what would it mean for a project to be nationally scalable? What kinds of limited resources might be available to help with those projects?
Well, I can certainly speak to those projects that we initially chose as examples for national scalability, and I think one of the ones that comes to mind easiest is the one we're doing on what we call smart mobile tools for inspectors, and recognizing that in the course of the discussion we found that obviously not only does every region do inspections, but all states do those inspections. Some to a degree have greater delegated responsibilities than others, but it's an example of one of our early projects that we chose, that we put some seed money in to scope the project, and upon identifying a positive return on investment, began the process of working on some implementation issues, a lean event. We'll be building a prototype. That project, when we started, we seeded it with several $100,000, and that's I'm not saying that those are going to be the same types of resources or the amount of resources available for other projects, but we chose 5, and each of those 5 projects received $200K to go out and do work on scoping and return on investment analyses, and then a second round of funding to start working on the actual development. So you find that as we identify these, at least those early projects, we were really we had the benefit of having the resources that we could provide some seed money. I think going forward, what I also want to have us consider is that we have a lot of processes that we're going to ultimately try to replace, not only the process and how resources are used in processes, but there may be a system, an IT system that's tied to an existing process. The hope over time, and it's easier said than done, is that we will be able to identify and free up resources by finding a way to transition away from antiquated processes and systems and freeing up resources to allow us to explore some of these new areas.
Great, thanks, Andy. Before we jump into, I think we have time maybe for one more question. I just wanted to clarify, we've had a few people ask if the PowerPoints will be available, and we are planning on making both the slides and hopefully recording available after this meeting. So yes, this information will be made available prior or after the webinar. Mike Bolak has a question. Mike, I'm going to try and unmute you if you want to ask your question. Actually, I'm just going to go ahead and read it. Sorry, a little technical glitch. So do states wait until the EPA regions initiate a region-wide conference call or meeting? These calls and meetings typically occur only every 6 months and may or may not correspond to the March 31st deadline.
I would ask Mark, maybe to validate what I'm going to say here, but there's the lead regions for each of the media programs, and they get together on a periodic basis. And this would be, the air division directors, the water division directors. That's a forum for these types of meetings. Mark, you probably have several forums that perhaps you could address it from a regional perspective on what are those opportunities within Region 7 that Mike might be able to see with Region 5, similar pattern.
Sure. I think one of the keys is to make sure there's a broad understanding within each regional office, and certainly here in ours, I will try not to speak for my fellow regions, about what the opportunity here is by the end of March. As it works in our region, we hold regular bi-monthly check-in calls with all 4 of our states. It's individual to each, and we'll certainly bring those up when those calls start next week. And a lot of that is just we found it's good to have those check-in moments with our states. I'm sure Tom can reflect from Region 1. There's hardly a week where some of us here aren't speaking to our counterparts in the state on something. And so just making sure we convey that message, particularly at our division director level, because I know most of our first-line program managers have routine monthly calls with all of their state counterparts. So, the thing we'll do and are doing is making sure people know this opportunity exists and see where things float up. I think we're in a pretty good place already on this in the region, given some of the projects I talked about earlier. So I guess the short answer, too, is just whether it be through lead region or regular meetings people have, make sure they're aware of this opportunity and take advantage of those, or I wouldn't get constrained in our region by any existing process we had, but really find where those opportunities exist and insert into those to build up those opportunities. And people like our process excellence team and Doug, who helps on e-enterprise, who's also within that same group, we're doing a lot of walkarounds just to share that with folks and try and draw out from the organization things that they may already be working on. And frankly, I've been very encouraged when we do that sort of recon work to hear just how much is already going on organically.
This is Tom. If I could just offer a state perspective here, if this process is going to work and be effective, it has to work for the states clearly. And I would strongly encourage states to start right away, if you haven't already, start thinking of what are the things that you really would like to try to get the time to work on to make better. And I can't think of a project or a program or a grant that doesn't offer that opportunity or couldn't be made more efficient, more effective. We could and should be doing this across the board over a long enough period of time. So I would encourage all states to be identifying potential ideas, and if you don't have an immediate forum in which to get that conversation with the region, I would encourage you to pick up the phone and call them, get in touch and say, we really want to talk to you about this. Talk to your sister states within your regions. If you have other states in your regions, see if they have ideas that they share with you, and really try to push forward the ideas that you have and get conversations going with your region if there are not already existing processes available within the time frame that's set up for this particular goal to identify some nationally scalable projects. But I would also encourage folks not to view the deadlines in here as drop dead dates for anything. We want to really think of this as the beginning of really a change in how we think about how we work together. And that's an important part of this institutionalization of these efforts.
Great, thanks, Tom. Andy, I think we've probably hit our max time. I'm going to turn it back over to you for our wrap-up, if that's all right.
Sure. I really want to thank everybody that attended the webinar today. We had, at my count, over 115 participants at any one point in the hour, and I want to thank you for your questions as well. These are extremely important to this entire effort that we have, both through the end of March and overall to the success of e-enterprise. We hope that this webinar is a step in communicating a clear picture of our vision for e-enterprise from the environment program, as well as its relationship to the partnership action plan and what we're trying to do by the end of March. And I want to encourage each of you to continue to provide your input, ask questions, be a part of the process, and that's most important, be a part of the entire process, and ultimately improve environmental results. There'll be a second webinar on February 2nd from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Both webinars are posted on the e-enterprise website, and there's certainly room for you to rejoin that call, and I would encourage you to please share that opportunity with your colleagues as well. We would really like to have more people join in this. So thank you very much again.